This is our second lesson in classical grammar, and the topic of lesson 2 is the parts of speech. Get my book open. So this is classical grammar. We're in lesson 2. In our first lesson, we discussed the English alphabet. We talked about the number of letters. We said there are 26 letters in English, 2 more than in Greek and 3 more than in Latin. We talked about how letters are used to make syllables. We talked about how syllables are joined together to make words and how words are joined together to make sentences. In this second lesson, we'll move on to study the parts of speech. So lesson 2, the title is The Parts of Speech, and we discussed this in detail yesterday in Latin grammar. And now in this lesson, we'll get a chance to look at the parts of speech in English and compare it to Latin. We're just going to walk through the text because the textbook on this topic is a little chaotic. It's not very well organized, so I'll try to help organize it a little bit. And we'll try to make a list of what the parts of speech are in English. So this is on page 19 of the Classical Grammar document, Chapter 2, the parts of speech. Let's take a look at the text. Paragraph number 8 reads, "The name of every object," and you'll notice object is in italics because that word is important in grammar studies. "The name of every object that has or is conceived by the mind to have an independent existence is called a noun substantive or merely a substantive." And we have to recite that point a number of times to make sure we get all of the details in our minds. The name of every object that has or is conceived by the mind to have an independent existence is called a noun substantive or merely a substantive. So the first part of speech that we come across is called a noun substantive. A noun substantive. And we see that the key words in the description of a noun substantive are object with independent existence. The name of an object, I actually should make sure I make that clear. The name of an object, not an object, but the name of an object. The name of an object with independent existence is called a noun substantive. And we have to keep reciting that to get that whole idea in our mind. The name of an object with independent existence is a noun substantive. The name of an object with independent existence is a noun substantive. The name, remember we're talking about words. The name of an object with independent existence is called a noun substantive. The key word here is substantive. Because let me turn my phone off here. In philosophy, in Aristotle's categories, we're going to learn about substances. A substance is a thing which exists by itself. And noun substantives are names of substances. Okay? That's what independent existence means. Independent existence means this idea this object, whether it's an actual thing that exists outside of us, or whether it's simply something that exists as an idea in our mind, is able to exist by itself. That's a substance. And we'll learn about what the alternatives to a substance are as we continue. And you're given a few examples there. Rose, flower, man, London, modesty. Those are all examples of noun substantives. Notice that rose, flower, man, London, these are things that exist outside the mind. And then modesty is an idea. Modesty is something that exists in the mind. It's an idea. And all of those examples, make sure you understand this, all of those examples, we're focusing on the names, not on the things themselves. We're not focusing on the idea of a rose or a rose out in the garden. We're not talking about a living man. We're talking about the name man, the name rose. We're talking about words in this lesson. This is not philosophy class. This is grammar class. We're talking about words. A noun substantive is a name for an object that has independent existence. In paragraph 9, we read, such words as can stand immediately before a substantive to denote some property that we perceive in objects is called a noun adjective or merely an adjective. So I'm going to list this as the second part of speech, even though in Latin this is not considered another part of speech. In Latin, an adjective is just considered a kind of noun. We're going to list noun adjective here. We're going to list noun adjective as the second part of speech. And a noun adjective is the name. Remember, we're talking about names. We're talking about words. A name which can stand immediately before a substantive. And you notice the word immediately is in italics. We can't ignore that. A name which can stand immediately before a substantive to denote some property. To denote some property, some quality or characteristic. A noun adjective. And this word adjective means set next to. That's why it's important to say a name which can stand next to. A name which can be placed immediately before a substantive. And we're given some examples in the book: sweet, sour, sharp, heavy, light. So if man is a substantive noun, man is the name of a substance, the name of an object that has independent existence. An adjective is a name which can stand immediately before the substantive and denote some property that we perceive to exist in the subject. So if I see the substantive noun man, I can add a word immediately before that substance. The name old denotes a property that we perceive to exist in a man. Old man, young man, tall man, short man, English man, Chinese man. Okay? That's an adjective. Now, it's likely that you've had elementary grammar classes and are familiar with these ideas. And if you are, that's good. But our goal in classical grammar is not to be familiar with them anymore. Our goal in classical grammar is to really master the details of this grammar instruction. So make sure you memorize these rules. Paragraph 8, paragraph 9, every detail of these descriptions, I'm not going to say definitions, but descriptions, every detail is important. The difference from one part of speech to another could just be in the specific words of the description. Now in the note, under paragraph 9, it says, it will be seen below that a particular class of adjective words are called participles. So this is interesting because this book lists participles as a class of adjective words, but I don't recommend that you do that. I recommend that you consider participles to be a separate part of speech. So participles. Do you see that? Under paragraph 9, there's a little note A. It says, it will be seen below that a particular class of adjective words are called participles. When it says adjective words, this is a little bit confusing. When it says adjective words, it's not talking about noun adjectives. This is one thing that's confusing in grammar books that I don't think teachers ever explain. What that little note on paragraph 9 says, adjective words. We have two different things here. Noun adjectives are one kind of adjective word. Okay? Noun adjectives are one kind of adjective word, but there are other kinds of adjective words. Pronouns are adjective words. Participles are adjective words. Adjective words are words that are joined to noun substantives. These are not a separate part of speech. It's a class of words. And this is just a definition that I'm making up for the sake of class. Adjective words are words that are joined to or used with substantive nouns. So in that little note where it talks about adjective words, it's not talking about noun adjectives. Noun adjectives are one kind of adjective words, but there are others. So don't think that our book is teaching us that participles are noun adjectives. That's not what it's teaching. We have to make that clear. We'll come back to that later. All right? So adjective words that are used next to or with substantive nouns. In paragraph number 10, we read about peculiar adjective words that are called articles. And in English, we're going to count these as a separate part of speech. So we're going to add a fourth part of speech, articles. So we're going to list participles as number 3. We'll come back to that later. And we're going to add articles. And examples of articles are the words a, an, and the or the. These are articles. It's important to note that in Latin there are no articles. So this part of speech doesn't exist in Latin. And we're going to see that there are more parts of speech in English than in Latin. And this is one of the reasons why, because in Latin there are no articles. There's no word in Latin for a or the. We can add them in translation, but they don't exist in Latin. So articles are a fourth part of speech. Then in the note under paragraph 10, it tells us that there are two kinds of articles. There are indefinite articles, and that's, we have a and an. And then we have definite articles. The. And that's very easy to understand. If we start with a definite article, if I'm talking about things, and you say, which one? Tell me definitely which one you're talking about. And I say, the book. Give me the book. There's only one that I'm talking about. And I identify it with the word the one and only, a definite one. But if I say, give me a towel, I don't care which towel you give me. There's no definite towel that I'm interested in. I just need a towel, any towel. That's an indefinite. And we mark that with an indefinite article. Okay? So the indefinite article a or an, and the difference with a and an is simply that an is used before a word that begins with a vowel. So we say an apple, an elephant. And then a is used before words that begin with consonants. A computer, a book, a person. All right? So make sure when you write and when you speak, you use the right article based on how the next word starts. An is used before a vowel. A is used before a consonant. So that's the fourth part of speech. The indefinite article, and if we scroll to the next page, we see the note on the definite article, marks a particular object. Then we go on to the fifth part of speech. In paragraph 11, we read, every word by which we express that persons or things do anything, are anything, or have anything done to them is called a verb. Let's repeat that to make sure we get all the details. Every word by which we express that persons or things do anything, or are anything, or have anything done to them is called a verb. So the fifth part of speech is a verb. And a verb is a word that expresses that persons or things do, are, and the third one is suffer. And don't think of suffering as experiencing pain, not like a suffering from a disease. Think of suffer as just receiving action. Okay? Suffering means something is done to you. So I kick the ball, that's I do something. The ball is kicked, the ball suffers an action. All right? Receives an action. And even better than are, if we say to do, to be, or to suffer, that would be better. A verb is a word that expresses that an object does something, is something, or suffers something, has something done to it. That's a verb. And we said in Latin class that the reason why a verb has this name verb, which just means word, is because in a sentence, we see this in Latin especially, in a sentence, the only word that's necessary to make a sentence is a verb. We can't have a sentence with just a noun. We can't have a sentence with just an adjective. But we can have a sentence with just a verb. like a command. Stop. That's a verb. Okay? So the fifth part of speech is a verb. And then there are a bunch of notes in our textbook about verbs. So let's take a look at them. Under paragraph 11, you see note A. To be, to which belong the forms is and are. To be is a peculiar verb by means of which we join the name of a property to the name of a thing. In English grammar, we learn that these are called copulas, right? You know what a copula is? The verb to be is used as a copula. It allows us to join subjects to predicates. It allows us to join substances to properties. To be is a peculiar verb by means of which we join the name of a property to the name of a thing. The rose is red. Rose is the subject, the object that we're saying something about. Red is a property. We're predicating the property red of the subject rose. And the verb is a copula, or a verb that joins the subject to the predicate. That's note A under paragraph 11. Then note B says that because the properties that we perceive in things are subject to change, that means the properties can be present in a subject and not present in a subject at different times. Because the properties that we perceive in things are subject to change, the words is and are, which are present tense, are altered to denote whether the property existed at a former time, or exists now, or will exist at a future time. So we can show different tenses with verbs. Verbs have different forms that allow us to express different times at which these things are said to be true. So we can say the rose is red, but if we have a number of roses, we have to change the form to express a plural number. We say roses are red, or the roses are red. If we want to say that the roses were red in the past, but they may not be red anymore, let's say it's fall and the flowers are fading and the roses have withered and now they're brown, we can say the rose was red. We can express a property that it existed in an object at a past time. And we can also say that a property will exist in an object in a future time. We can say the rose will be red. And so the tenses of verbs can change. Verbs can change forms to express different times. And one thing you need to jot down in your notes is that what makes a verb different from the other parts of speech is that verbs express time. Verbs express time. Verbs express time. Okay? So the fifth part of speech is a verb. Verbs express the ideas of doing, being, or suffering. And we learned about the first type of verb, the verb to be, which is important because it's used as a copula to join subjects to predicates or things to properties. In the second note under paragraph 11, we see that verbs are especially useful in language because they allow us to express different time. Note C, to become, notice it's in italics. To become is a similar verb by which we mark the acquisition of some new property. Becoming. A road becomes impracticable. So becoming, this verb to become, expresses change. So not only can verbs express time, they can also express change. Note D, the notion of a verb may be added to a substantive without being formally asserted of it. The forms which are used for this purpose are called participles. And I want you to make sure you understand that participles are a separate part of speech. Participles were mentioned under adjective nouns, and now we see participles are mentioned again under verbs, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. We said that adjective nouns or adjective words, we said, are words that can be added to substantives. Adjective nouns can be added to substantives, and participles are another part of speech that can be added to substantives. And we'll see what they are in a little bit. We see two examples of participles there in note D under paragraph 11. We see a sleeping boy. Sleeping is an example of a participle. And here's what a participle is. A participle is a word that has the characteristics of both an adjective and a verb. It's used to express a property of a substantive, but it also expresses time, and so it's like a verb. That's what a participle is, and we'll make that clear in a minute. In the next note, note E, we see hence, or therefore, a participle is an adjective word that besides the notion of a property, besides what an adjective noun is used to express, also conveys the notion of time, or of a completed or incompleted state. So what a participle is, we'll use that note there at point E as our description of a participle. A participle is an adjective word that besides the notion of a property conveys that of time. So this third part of speech here, we're going to describe participle as an adjective word. Remember, adjective word and noun adjective are not the same thing. An adjective word that expresses both the idea of a property and time. A participle is an adjective word that expresses the notion of both property or some quality of some kind and the time. You got that? Participle. The reason why they're called participles, I explained this in Latin grammar class. The reason why they're called participles is because they participate or they share in the characteristics of both an adjective noun and a verb. Participles are sort of combinations of noun adjectives and verbs. They express a property, like a noun adjective, and they express time, like a verb. Some examples of participles. If I say, would you like some iced tea? Would you like some iced tea? Iced is a participle. It can be translated with the expression has been iced. Iced tea is tea that has been iced. Iced is used like an adjective to describe the tea, but it also expresses time. It says that the tea was iced at some time in the past. It's an example of a participle. Another example, running water. Running is a participle. If I were to ask you what kind of water, you could say running water. Running expresses a quality or a property like an adjective noun, but it also expresses time. It's present tense. So because this part of speech can express both a property, it can be set next to a substantive noun, and it expresses time, it's a combination of adjective, noun, and verb, and that's what a participle is. Okay? The best way to learn what participles are is to study Latin grammar, because in Latin grammar they actually have different forms, and you can get a very clear idea in your mind what a participle is by studying Latin grammar. And then when you come into English grammar, if you know Latin and you come into English grammar, you'll be able to clearly see which words are participles. If all you study is English, it's difficult to identify the parts of speech. But if you study Latin, because the participles have different forms, it makes it very easy to see them in English. Okay? So those are participles. Let's get back to our text. Paragraph number 12. Paragraph number 12. The next part of speech, we have here our adverbs, Such words as add to the notion of a property or action some circumstance of time, place, or manner are called adverbs. So in this book, the sixth part of speech that's listed are adverbs. Adverbs. Words that add to the notion of a property. So they add more information to a property. So for example, if I say, the stove is hot, that's a very simple description. The stove is hot. If you ask, how hot is the stove? How hot? And I add to that and I say, it's very hot. An adverb is a word that adds to the notion of a property. So the word very adds to the notion of the property hot. Very is an adverb. If I say Josh is reading, and you ask, how is he reading? I say, Josh is reading quickly. And I add a word that adds to the notion of a property. He's reading. How is he reading? He's reading quickly. I add some description. I add more information to the description. That word is an adverb. Words that add to the notion of a property, very hot, or to an action, reading quickly. They add some circumstance of time, place, or manner. They talk about how or when or where the property or action takes place. Those are called adverbs. And the word adverb simply means added to a word, not added to a verb, because they can also be added to adjectives and participles. So don't get into the error of modern grammar textbooks that often teach that an adverb is a word that's added to a verb. That's not what they are. The word verb just means word. An adverb is a word that can be added to an adjective or a verb or another adverb. I can say, how is Josh reading? I can say, Josh is reading quickly. I can add an adverb to a verb, but I can also add an adverb to an adverb. I can say, Josh is reading very quickly. Now there's two adverbs. I added very to quickly, which is an adverb. So adverbs are not added to verbs. They can be added to a number of different parts of speech to express quality, to clarify a more complex idea. We can add more descriptive terms. Those are adverbs. And our textbook, fortunately, explains this. In Note A, it says, though these are called adverbs, or words joined to verbs, they are also added to adjectives. And it gives some examples like I just gave you. Note B, the adjective and the adverb are essentially the same. The adjective and the adverb are essentially the same, both being names of properties. So adverbs and adjectives have this in common. They are both names of properties. We shall find that sometimes the same word is both an adjective and an adverb. And you'll find, in English especially, if you're given an exercise where you're asked to identify the part of speech for a word, it's very difficult. And if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find that the same word can be used as a different number of parts of speech. You'll find that a word can sometimes be used as an adverb, sometimes as an adjective, sometimes as a preposition. So if you find parts of speech difficult, if sometimes you feel confused about parts of speech, there's not something wrong with you. The same word can be used as a different number of parts of speech. Do you understand that? Based on how it's being used. So the word itself is not necessarily one part of speech. It's how the word is used that determines what part of speech it is. Jot that down. What part of speech a word is, just write a summary of this. What part of speech a word is based on how the word is used, not necessarily the word itself. A word can be used as more than one part of speech. So if you find parts of speech confusing, you're not crazy. They can be confusing sometimes. And if you've done those exercises where you've looked up words to see what part of speech they are, you know that the dictionary will say adjective, adverb, preposition, right? It'll list different definitions based on how the word is used with different parts of speech. So that's all for adverb. Next, in paragraph 13, we move on to the seventh part of speech. In paragraph 13, we read, a pronoun is a word that stands for a noun. So the seventh part of speech that we learn about in English is a pronoun. In Latin, this word pro is a preposition and it means for. So a pronoun is simply a word that's used for a noun. The word pro simply means for pronoun, a word that's used for a noun. That's the simple definition we're given for paragraph 13 there. A pronoun is simply a word that stands for a noun, and it's important to note that a pronoun is one type of adjective word. Remember, an adjective word is a word that's joined to a substantive noun. to express some property of that noun. A pronoun can be used as an adjective word. Some pronouns are not used as adjective words. Some pronouns can be used as adjective words. Why I tell you that is because, again, it can be difficult to determine whether a word is a pronoun or an adjective because some pronouns look like adjectives. So if you have a hard time with parts of speech, it's not because you're dumb or you don't understand grammar. It's because they're complicated. It's difficult. So the seventh part of speech is a pronoun. And we're going to learn some properties of pronouns now. Note A under paragraph 13. Pronouns, what do pronouns do? Why do we use pronouns? They're not necessary. We can write our entire lives and never use a pronoun if we choose to. Why are they necessary? They're not necessary. They're helpful. Note A says, pronouns save us from the necessity of repeating the noun. And if you were to take written language and take all the pronouns out and just use the nouns again and again and again with no pronouns, it would sound ridiculous. Samuel went to the store and Samuel wanted to buy some milk, but when Samuel got to the counter with Samuel's milk, Samuel couldn't find Samuel's wallet, so Samuel had to ask Samuel's mother to let Samuel borrow some money so Samuel could buy Samuel's milk because Samuel didn't have Samuel's wallet. It sounds ridiculous to use the nouns over and over and over with no pronouns. Pronouns allow our speech to be much clearer, much simpler when the nouns are already known. Okay? So pronouns save us from the necessity of repeating the noun. They're meant to be used for the sake of what's called euphony, or pleasantness of speech. They make our speech more pleasant. They are convenient, the book says. They are convenient, but not necessary. They're not a necessary part of speech. They're convenient. They help us to improve the style of our writing. They make our writing and speaking more pleasant. When the persons we're speaking of are known or things, when the persons or things that we name, the substantives, when they're already known, we don't need to continue naming them. We can refer to them with a pronoun. And sometimes they may already be known without us naming them at all, and we can speak with pronouns and not even give the substantive nouns, because the person we're talking to already knows what we're talking about. So pronouns are not necessary. They're used for the sake of improving the style of our speaking and writing. And you're given an example there in that next paragraph. So let's move down to paragraph 14. In paragraph 14, we find the next part of speech. We read, a word that marks the relation of one thing to another is called a preposition. A preposition. So the eighth part of speech we learn of is a preposition. The preposition. This is the eighth part of speech listed in our text. A word that marks the relation of one thing to another. And I'm going to write up here, relation between words, because we're talking about words. This is grammar. This is not reasoning or natural philosophy. We're not talking about ideas. We're not talking about things. We're talking about words. A preposition is a word that's used to show the relationship between different words in a sentence. A preposition. A word that shows the relationship between different words in a sentence. If we were cavemen, we wouldn't use prepositions. And I gave you some examples of this in Latin grammar yesterday. If we were cavemen, we wouldn't talk with prepositions. It's easy to talk like a caveman, even though we don't know if cavemen existed. It's easy to sound like the fictional caveman by just removing many of the parts of speech and talking with nouns or talking with present tense verbs. Prepositions help to explain the relationship between words in a sentence, and we have examples here in our text. In note A, under paragraph 14, we read, therefore, on, in, over, under, through, above, below, from, and so on are prepositions. All of those words are used to express relationships between different words in a sentence. Okay? I saw a bird on the roof. On expresses the relationship between bird and roof. I saw a snake under the shed. Under expresses the relation between the snake and the shed. I saw a snake under the shed. I drove through the city, or I drove my car through the city. The relationship between my car and the city is expressed by the preposition through the city. I drove through the city. I drove around the city. I drove on a bridge over the city. I drove through a tunnel under the city. All of those words express relations between the car and the city. Those are prepositions. They stand immediately before a substantive. They stand immediately before a substantive, and that's why they're called preposition. They're positioned before the substantive. Preposition. Positioned before a substantive. They're used, if we go down to note B there, the primary relations by prepositions are relations in space. They're used to express relationships with regard to space. Relations of local position, or position that's related to space and place. The prepositions used to denote these relations in space were then transferred to analogous relations of time. What that means is that originally, let me explain this a little bit because that can be confusing. Originally, as language developed, prepositions had simple, literal ideas. So if I said, on the way to Canada, Virginia is before Pennsylvania. Before means in front of, and it means in front of in place. You understand that? Or I stood before the door. I stood in front of the door. Originally, the prepositions had simple, literal ideas of place or space. But over time, they began to be used figuratively to express other ideas. Originally, they referred to space or place. But later, with an example being time, people started to realize that, wait, I can use the preposition before, not to just mean before in place, but I can also use it to mean before in time. So there's different kinds of definitions of pronouns and of prepositions and of all words. There's simple literal meanings of words, and then there are figurative or rhetorical meanings of words. In English dictionaries, you often won't see that explained. You'll just be given lists of different meanings. But if you look at a good Latin dictionary, like the Oxford Latin Dictionary, you'll see that they actually separate literal definitions from figurative definitions, and that's very helpful. Okay? The reason why the textbook is telling us this is because the meanings of prepositions, if you look them up in a dictionary, can be very complicated. It can look like the preposition has lots of different meanings. But if you think about them, you'll see that there's a simple, literal meaning for the preposition. And then all the other meanings are figurative. Do you understand that? So there's a simple, literal meaning which you should learn. And then you should understand that men have used those prepositions to express the same idea but in different senses. And that's what makes the meaning of prepositions sometimes difficult to understand. That's especially true when we're doing translation work. When you're translating from one language to another and you read a preposition in a language and you have to figure out how to translate it into another language, it can be very confusing. And if you look up a preposition in a Latin dictionary, you can have one simple preposition like in, and it can have 30 different definitions. And it's very difficult in translation to figure out which definition, which English meaning you should use in translation. You'll see this if you study Latin reading. When you study Latin reading, we've seen, if you've studied the first few lessons, in principio, it means in the beginning, in. In mundum, it means into the world. In can also be translated as with. In can be translated as on. In can be translated as at. So that just the preposition in can have 20 different English translations. So prepositions can be confusing because they have a simple literal meaning and they also have figurative meanings. That's what that note B is talking about. Okay? So there are primary relations expressed by prepositions, and I know this is getting a little deep. There are primary relations expressed by prepositions, simple, literal meanings, and then there are figurative meanings of prepositions, which can become complicated. Rule number 15, we learn of another part of speech. A word that joins notions or assertions together is called a conjunction. A word that joins together And the easiest way to define this in your notes is just to say a conjunction is a word that joins different parts of speech together. Because that's what our minds are actually doing. What our minds are doing is joining ideas together. If you say roses are red, all that you're doing, your mind is taking the idea of roses and the idea of redness and is joining them together and saying roses are red. That's what sentence making is. That's what speech is. You're simply joining ideas together. And if you say roses are red and violets are blue, now you're taking two sentences and joining them together. Okay? So conjunctions are words that show that we're joining things together. And we want them to be joined together in a certain way. You can come with me to the gym, or you can play in the yard. Or means you have to choose one or the other. Okay? You can come with me to the gym and to the store means you can do both. So I'm joining two things in speech, but I'm joining them in different ways. That's expressed with conjunctions. And it's very important because something can be true or false based on how it's joined together. Okay? Those are conjunctions, pretty simple. And, but, or, therefore, however. Some conjunctions are used just to join words. Some conjunctions are used to join sentences. Some conjunctions are used to join whole paragraphs. Right? You start a new paragraph with, therefore, having said all of that, I'd like to join this next paragraph to what has already been said. Therefore is a conjunction. However is a different conjunction. Paragraph 16, we learn another part of speech, the 10th part of speech in English. You see the word interjection, a word, generally a simple sound used to express some feeling. A word used to express some feeling, often a simple sound, just an expression of emotion, like whoa, hey, ouch. A word used to express some feeling is called an interjection. Interjection. That's paragraph 16. That's the 10th part of speech. And the final part of speech. All right, so in lesson 2 here, we're about 51 minutes, so I'm going to start wrapping up. Okay? An interjection is the 10th part of speech. Now, looking at the board, we see we have 10 parts of speech in English. 10 parts of speech. That's different from what we learn in Latin. In Latin, there are only 8 parts of speech. Right? In Latin, there are 8 parts of speech. In English, we find 10 parts of speech. And I just want to make sure you see the differences. The first important difference is that in English, substantives and adjectives are often treated as 2 separate parts of speech. Okay? Substantive nouns and adjective nouns are treated as 2 separate parts of speech. In Latin, they're 1 part of speech. They're just called nouns. And there's just 2 kinds of nouns. There's substantives and adjectives. So the same is true in English. We can consider these as 1 part of speech, but 2 different kinds of that 1 part of speech, or we can treat them like 2 different parts of speech. It really doesn't matter in English. So that's the first difference between English grammar and Latin grammar. Nouns and adjectives, substantives and adjectives can be treated as 2 separate parts of speech. And the other difference is articles. There are no articles in Latin. There are articles in English. And that's why we have 2 extra parts of speech to give us a total of 10. Whereas Latin has 8. It's important to understand articles because when we study Greek grammar, there are articles in Greek. All right? So when you understand articles in English, it will help you in Greek because we do use articles in Greek even though we don't use articles in Latin. So in English, to wrap this up, there are 10 parts of speech. All right? And what are the parts of speech? The parts of speech are different classes of words that exist. When we begin as babies, our minds think in terms of simple names. We just name things. Baba, juice, toy, right? Babies speak with simple nouns. As time goes on,
I didn't understand that.
Yeah, I didn't either. Sorry. As time goes on, we try to communicate more and more clearly, more and more complicated ideas, right? As we grow up, we gain more experiences, our ideas become more complicated, and we need more words to express those complicated ideas. So we have to move from speaking just with nouns to use other parts of speech, other kinds of words. We have to use verbs to express action and time. We have to express prepositions, use prepositions to express different relationships between words. All these different parts of speech, as we study the parts of speech, learn the words that belong to these different classes, it allows our speech to become more and more, more mature. There's a word nuanced. You probably don't know what that word means. More complex. We can express complicated ideas clearly, whereas when we're children and we don't know grammar and don't study language, we can't express complicated ideas. And as you get older and get into life, you're going to be pressured to express more and more complicated ideas. And you can't go into adult life with the language of a baby. Your language has to become mature. You have to be able to express complex ideas because your adult life is going to be complex. The ideas, the experiences, the feelings, the desires that you have, they're going to get more and more complicated, and you're going to have a language that allows you to express those complicated ideas. Do you understand that? If you get into business or any kind of professional studies, you want to get more serious about philosophy or religion, your language is going to limit what you can communicate. And you're going to develop a language that can develop with your mind and allow you to communicate complicated ideas to other people using a combination of simple terms. So to study the parts of speech, to understand their different functions, to understand how our speech works and how all different ideas are communicated, that's the purpose of studying grammar. Okay? The parts of speech are the building blocks of language. If you only know how to use 2 or 3 of them, you're going to talk like a baby your whole life. And many people do. If you learn to use all of the parts of speech, that's what it means to have mastery of the language. You know how to use all of the different kinds of words to express all of the different kinds of ideas that we have. That's what it means to speak more maturely, to be eloquent, to be able to articulate complicated ideas. So we have to learn the names of the 10 parts of speech here in English. We have to begin practicing identifying words. So anytime you're reading, anytime you're looking at words, in the back of your head you should be asking yourself, what part of speech is this? What part of speech is this? Do you understand that? When you look a word up in a dictionary, you should ask yourself, what part of speech is this word? Because if you know the descriptions of the parts of speech, you know the functions of the parts of speech, it helps you to understand the words and what they're actually used for. And it also helps you to figure out how to express complex ideas when you need to. So study the names of the 10 parts of speech. Just because you learned them in Latin isn't good enough because they're different in English. Study the names of the 10 parts of speech in English. Make sure you know the description for each of the parts of speech, and make sure that you can give examples of the parts of speech. So if I say, hey Daniel, give me an example of an adverb, you need to be able to give examples of adverbs, of prepositions, of pronouns, of articles, of verbs, of substantive nouns, of adjective nouns. Okay? Study the names of the parts of speech, the descriptions of the parts of speech, and practice to be able to give examples of the parts of speech. That's everything for lesson 2 in classical grammar.